Joining me now is Michael Beschloss, MSNBC presidential historian, and Joshua Stanton, president of the Defense of Dignity Center and counsel at Perry Law. Thank you both for being here. And I will start with you, Michael Beschloss. You've covered the presidency for a very long time. This concept that they've created of essentially unitary president who cannot be stopped by Congress or anyone in the executive branch, what do you make of it?
It's ridiculous. There is no such thing. This is an invention. If we brought James Madison back, who did much to invent the system that we're talking about, his whole thing was balance of power, checks and balances between three branches, co-equal, a president, a Supreme Court, a Congress. And so what we've got now is, and he's telling us 16 months before the next presidential election, Donald Trump is the first person, the only person in all of American history who has said, if you elect me, my intention is to establish, just as you're saying, Joy, a presidential dictatorship, telling you, the American people, your family, everyone you know, your friends, others, every private aspect of your life, if you're running a business, there's not going to be an independent Federal Trade Commission. Donald Trump will tell your business what to do. If you're part of a media organization, as we are, there will not be, for instance, an independent Federal Communications Commission. Donald Trump, if he hears something on MSNBC or another network or doesn't like something he reads in the New York Times, which is probably pretty likely, he can do a lot to have, what we do, what all of us do, stilled and perhaps even those organizations abolished. We've never seen anything like this in American history. All I'm saying to our friends who are watching us tonight, take this very seriously. Don't think this is a joke.
Right. And Mr. Stanton, I struggle to find the liberals who created the executive branch. I struggle to find them in the people such as Mr. Madison and Jefferson, et cetera. They weren't liberals. But the second part of what Mr. Vogt said, I think, is the point. You can't create conservative outcomes unless the president, and it's a president we like, has complete control. So just from a legal standpoint, talk a little bit about this idea. I'm going to read, let me before you do that, let me read a little thing from The Economist. It says Republicans believe that they will be able to enact their program only if they first defang the so-called deep state by making tens of thousands of top civil servants sackable. These changes would give an overmighty president direct control of the Department of Justice. By being able to sack all the purported dissenters, the administration would obliterate the norm of legal independence. If so, Trumpian resentment would be channeled into concrete vengeance. The prospect should concern all Americans. It's essentially Viktor Orbanism or Putinism in America.
That's right. This is an extreme and dangerous theory that even fairly right-wing legal thinkers generally have not subscribed to. And just to have some understanding of how fringe this is, when Justice Alito was up for confirmation for his Supreme Court seat, and more recently when Amy Coney Barrett was up for confirmation on her Supreme Court seat, both of them responded in relation to probably the most significant Supreme Court case governing the powers of the presidency, which is Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which governs specifically what the president can and cannot do and what Congress can regulate and legislate and prevent the president from doing. In each of them, Alito and Coney Barrett suggested that they thought that that was the right law. So what we're talking about when we think about a fringe theory, this is a theory that's to the right of, further right of what Alito and Coney Barrett have already said. So yes, this is a dangerous theory.
Michael, it strikes me that it is also it's an admission of defeat in terms of the culture, in terms of them admitting that the outcomes they want and that his fans want. And the reason they love Trump is that he's promising to bypass democracy to implement the things they want that a vast majority of Americans don't want. It's Nixon, but much, 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 much worse.
Much, much, much worse. Exactly, Joy. And here's a situation where they're gaming the existing system. They're not talking about doing things that are illegal, interestingly enough. And there's a parallel for that in Germany, 1933. Hitler, and I'm not comparing Donald Trump to Hitler, but in terms of a system, Hitler basically used the existing system in Germany in 1933 so that the will of an angry minority was translated into power and dictatorship. Exactly the same thing happening here. If we had asked all Americans in a fair poll, do you love democracy? I would say probably, 70% would say I do. Do you think that there should be abortion rights? Do you think that the press should not be intimidated? Do you think businesses should not be dictated to? I would say probably 65, 70% of Americans would say, no, I'm terrified by those things. But what the Trump people are doing is they're taking advantage of a defect, a flaw, a weakness in our system that goes all the way back to 1787, which says that if you game it, if you manipulate it, if you appoint certain people to the Supreme Court, which is owned 1/3 by Donald Trump appointed and people who like him, Congress may be dominated by Republicans 16 months from now. If all of that happens, the will of an angry 30% minority, or maybe a little bit more than that, can be made to rule all of us, and Donald Trump will be made into our dictator.
Right, and there'll be nothing to ever remove or stop him. Speaking of people he appointed.
That will be the last free election.
It would be the last free election, I think, to be certain. Speaking of people that Donald Trump appointed, Aileen Cannon. Let's talk about her, Joshua Stanton. Here, Donald Trump is praising her. He did appoint her. She was in her 30s. She doesn't have much experience at all to be a judge with this much power, but she is going to be judging the case of his theft and retention of classified documents. Take a listen to what he said about her recently.
Do you have any indication the judge will grant this motion?
I don't know. I know it's a very highly respected judge, a very smart judge, and a very strong judge.
Well, you appointed her.
I did, and I'm very proud to have appointed her, but she's very smart and very strong and loves our country. I mean, loves our country. We need judges that love our country so they do the right thing.
And that is a message to Aileen Cannon, Joshua Stanton, to Judge Cannon, before she decides whether or not the trial of Donald Trump will be scheduled before the election or after. He would very much like it to be after. That seems to me that he is speaking to her, and she seems to be very MAGA. What are the risks if she were to rule and say, yes, indeed, we will hold this trial until Donald Trump is in a position to pardon himself and end this trial?
Well, it seems unlikely, even for this judge, to set the trial so far or delay it far, far into the future. Of course, we've been wrong about what this judge would do in the past. But that being said, a more measured response and perhaps a more expected response might be for the judge to set it sometime, some trial date into the future that maybe neither side would really love, with the concept that she might say, hey, come back and we'll get some status updates. We'll see how things are going. But the real risk here is, I think Trump has not really done himself any favors by making these public statements, because the judge will surely want to avoid an appearance of impropriety. And by judge making these very clear sort of undertones in his praise of the judge, in wanting her to rule in his favor, creates at least some possibility of that in her ruling. So I don't think that she will appreciate these statements, even if she were going to rule for him in the first place.
You know, Michael Beschloss did the praying hands, and I was thinking the praying hands because, as Lawrence O'Donnell said, Michael Beschloss, Donald Trump holds the ultimate incentive for her, meaning he becomes president, Clarence Thomas retires to permanently vacation with his billionaire friends, who, by the way, probably won't want to take him anywhere anymore because he can't give him anything anymore. Right. And she gets on the Supreme Court in her late 30s. And then there's no incentive for her to behave herself. If she's MAGA, she can MAGA, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Well, and the other thing is we have to ask the question, just as Josh was saying, why did Donald Trump choose this moment to tell the American people that he will become a dictator if elected? You might think it might be more politically shrewd to pretend to be a moderate and then do all this if he is elected. And I would give two reasons. The major reason is, if Americans think that Donald Trump is inevitable and that fascism is the wave of the American future, people will begin in their minds to censor themselves, and they will make adjustments, and everything they do between now and 16 months from now at the time of the election, they might say, well, maybe I shouldn't say this, because if Trump is reelected, he may start jailing people. He may retaliate against people. And very specifically, if Donald Trump right now wants to intimidate jurors in Fort Pierce, Florida, in Georgia, in Washington, D.C., in other trials, you know, what better way than to give them the idea that if they are cast a vote that sends Donald Trump to prison or causes him to be convicted, then if Donald Trump becomes president, who's going to be first on the enemies list? Remember what President Obama said, when we lose true democracy, people get hurt. That's what's going to happen if this happens.
And I will note that as he is praising Judge Aileen Cannon, at least for now, before she maybe does something he doesn't like, he is threatening prosecutors, threatening them. And so far, no one's done anything about that.
This is a blanket threat. You're right.
Exactly. Michael Beschloss, Joshua Stanton, thank you both. And up next on the ReidOut.